The crow's foot nailed to the barn door was still dripping blood when Connor Fairweather found it at first light, and the sight turned his stomach to ice even before he understood what it meant. He stood in the chill autumn air with his coffee mug cooling in one hand, staring at the crude talisman of bone and twine. 3 crow talons bound together with gut string, the wood beneath it stained dark. His breath misted in the dawn as his mind raced through possibilities. A prank seemed unlikely this far from town. A warning from a neighbor even more so. He had kept to himself these past 5 years, worked his land honestly, paid his taxes to the crown, bothered no one. Behind him, the farmhouse door opened and Elara Lightfoot stepped onto the porch, wrapping her worn shawl around her shoulders against the morning cold. She was small for an orc, barely reaching his shoulder, with a wiry build that belied surprising strength. Her green skin looked almost gray in the pre-dawn light, and her dark hair was still loose from sleep, hanging past her pointed ears. The 2 small tusks that jutted from her lower jaw caught the lantern light as she opened her mouth to greet him. Then she saw the crow's foot. The color drained from her face so fast Connor thought she might faint. Her hand shot out to grip the porch railing, knuckles going pale against the green of her skin. Her breath came short and sharp, and her eyes went wide with something that looked like recognition and terror mixed together. "Elara," Connor set down his mug and moved toward her. "What is it? What does this mean?" She could not seem to tear her gaze from the bloody token. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "The Crow's Talon Company. They mark the farms they intend to collect from." She swallowed hard. "If you do not pay, they burn you out. They never fail to collect." Connor felt his jaw tighten. He had heard stories of mercenary bands that preyed on frontier settlements, but this far north he had thought himself safe. "How much do they demand?" "Half." Elara finally looked at him, and he saw genuine fear in her dark eyes. "Half of everything you harvested this season. Grain, livestock, coin. They come at the new moon with wagons, and if you cannot pay or will not, they take it all and burn what remains as an example. That's robbery. That is survival to them." She descended the steps slowly, as though moving through deep water, and approached the barn door. Her hand trembled as she reached out but stopped just short of touching the crow's foot. "I know this work. I know the man who makes these marks." Connor studied her face. In the 2 years since Elara had appeared at his gate, half-starved and desperate, she had told him almost nothing of her past. He had not pressed. A woman arrived asking for work and shelter. He had shelter and work to offer, and her business was her own. But he had wondered. She knew things a farm girl should not know. How to read tracks a week old, which way a man would run when startled, how to move through woods without sound. She startled at loud noises and watched the road with the wariness of someone expecting pursuit. He had fallen in love with her somewhere between the first winter, when she had worked 16-hour days beside him to save his breeding sow from milk fever, and the spring, when he had found her singing to the new lambs in a language he did not know. It was a quiet love, a steady thing that grew like oak roots, and he had never spoken it aloud. She was young, perhaps 20 to his 32 years, and she had come to him for safety. To burden her with his feelings seemed a cruelty. Instead, he had left new boots outside her door when her old ones wore through. He had added her name to the farm ledger as partner rather than hired hand, splitting the profits down the middle. He had learned to make the spiced porridge her mother had made, the recipe teased out through casual questions over months. He had loved her in silence and small gestures and told himself it was enough. "You know them," he said quietly. Elara nodded, still staring at the crow's foot. "I traveled with the Crow's Talon Company for 3 years. They took me when I was 15 when they raided the caravan I was traveling with. I am small, I am quiet, I track well. They used me as a scout. She wrapped her arms around herself. I escaped 2 years ago. I ran for 6 days through the thornwood before I lost them. When I came to your gate, I thought I was going to die. Connor remembered that day. Late autumn, much like now, the leaves turning and the air growing cold. She had been a wraith at his fence line, thin as a willow switch, her clothes in tatters and her feet bloody. She had asked only for water. He had given her a bed, a meal, and a place. "They will recognize you," he said. "Yes." Her voice was flat. "Their leader is a man named Garrett Moss. He does not forget anyone who costs him property." She finally turned to look at Connor, and he saw the war happening behind her eyes. "I should leave. If I am gone when they come, perhaps they will not be as harsh. Perhaps—" No. The word came out harder than he intended. Elara blinked at him, surprised. Connor reached up and tore the crow's foot from the barn door, hurling it into the dirt. "This is our farm, yours and mine. Your name is on the deed as much as mine." "It is not," Elara said quietly. "You have been generous, Connor, kinder than anyone I have known, but the ledger is not a legal document. The land is yours. I am hired help and an orc besides. No magistrate would, then I will fix that today." Connor was already moving toward the house, his mind racing through what needed to be done. "I will ride to the county seat and have the deed redrawn. Equal partners, legal and binding. Then we will go to the militia and report this threat." Elara caught his arm as he passed, her grip surprisingly strong. "The militia will do nothing. The Crow's Talon Company pays them to look the other way. That is how they have operated for a decade across 4 counties. I know their ledgers, Connor. I carried messages for them. The captain of the local militia takes 30 silver crowns each season to be elsewhere when the collectors come." Connor felt fury building in his chest, hot and righteous. "Then we will fight." "We cannot." Elara's voice broke slightly on the words. "There are 40 of them. Trained soldiers, mercenaries who have fought in real wars. We are 2 farmers with a hunting bow and a skinning knife. They will kill us." "Then what do you suggest?" Connor turned to face her fully, and saw tears standing in her eyes, though her jaw was set with determination. "That I give them half of everything we worked for. That I let them rob us and smile while I do it. I suggest you pay them and I leave." Elara released his arm and stepped back. "It is the only way you survive this. They will take their tax and move on. You will have enough to make it through winter if you are careful. And I will be gone, so Garrett will not take his anger at my escape out on you." "No," Connor said it again, softer this time. He reached out and took her hand, rough and calloused from work, smaller than his but no less strong. "I will not pay robbers, and I will not lose you. We will find another way." Elara looked down at their joined hands as though she had never seen such a thing before. "Why? Why would you risk everything for this?" "For me?" The question hung between them in the cold morning air. Connor could hear the chickens beginning to stir in their coop, the distant lowing of the cattle in the near pasture. The farm was waking around them, the land they had worked together, the life they had built. He thought about all the things he had never said, all the feelings he had kept locked behind his teeth for fear of driving her away. "Because it is ours," he said finally. "Because you are not hired help and you never were. Because he stopped, swallowed, tried again. Because I would rather fight and lose than surrender what matters." He could not quite say the full truth, not yet, not when she was already frightened and talking about leaving. But Elara's eyes searched his face, and he thought perhaps she heard what he could not speak. "You are a fool," she said quietly, but there was no heat in it, probably. Connor squeezed her hand once and released it. "But I am a fool with a good fence, a barn full of hay, and 2 years of watching you work. I know you know how to fight, Elara. I have seen you move." I know you are more than you pretend to be." Elara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier. "If we do this, truly do this, we cannot do it stupidly. We will not meet them in open combat. We will not try to be heroes. We will use every advantage we have, and we will be ruthless about it." "Agreed. And if it goes wrong, if they take the farm, you do not try to die bravely. You run. You live. You rebuild somewhere else." Connor wanted to argue that point, but the look in Elara's eyes told him she would walk away right now if he did not agree. "All right. Then we have until the new moon." Elara looked up at the sky, calculating. 5 days. "We prepare, we plan, and we make this ground as dangerous for them as we can." They spent that first day in careful preparation. Connor rode to the county seat as planned, though not to seek help from the militia. Instead, he went to the magistrate's office and had a new deed drawn up, splitting the farm equally between Connor Fairweather and Elara Lightfoot. The clerk raised an eyebrow at the orc surname but said nothing, and Connor paid the fee without comment. The deed was sealed and registered by noon. On his way out of town, he stopped at the smithy and spent coin he could ill afford on materials. 10 pounds of iron nails, a roll of steel wire, 2 new axe heads, and the finest boar spear the smith had in stock. The weapon was a beautiful thing, 7 feet of ash wood with a broad steel blade and crossbar to prevent the boar from running up the shaft. It was made for holding off 400 pounds of charging bristle and fury. Connor thought it would do for men as well. When he returned home at dusk, he found Elara had not been idle. She had dragged every loose log and piece of timber from the woodpile and stacked them strategically around the farmyard. She had drawn maps on slate boards, marking sightlines and approaches. She had sharpened every blade they owned and laid out their tools like weapons: mattocks and scythes, hay forks and splitting mauls. "They will come from the road," she said without preamble when he dismounted. "Garrett likes to arrive just after full dark, when people are tired from the day but not yet asleep. He brings 6 wagons and 20 men for the collection. The rest of the company camps a mile back, ready to reinforce if there is trouble." Connor carried his purchases to the porch and unwrapped the boar spear. Elara's eyes widened when she saw it. "You know how to use that?" "I have hunted boar," Connor said. "I know the principle. You set it and let them come to you. Men are not boar. They think, they dodge, they work together." "Then you will teach me what I need to know." Connor met her gaze. "I know you are more than a scout, Elara. Scouts do not know collection protocols. Scouts do not carry messages about payment ledgers. You were inside that company. You know how they fight." Elara looked away, and for a moment he thought she would not answer. Then she sighed. "Garrett took an interest in me. He thought I could be trained as a raider, not just a tracker. For a year before I escaped, I trained with the swords. I was not good enough, not fast enough, but I learned how they move, how they think." She touched one of the small tusks at the corner of her mouth, a nervous gesture he had seen before. "I learned which men would hesitate to strike a small target and which would not. I learned where they expected attack to come from and where they did not watch." "Good." Connor began unloading the rest of his supplies. "Then we use that." They worked through the night and into the next day. Elara taught Connor the basics of defensive fighting: how to hold ground rather than seek it, how to use reach and barriers to offset greater numbers, how to make an enemy come to you on your terms. Connor was not a natural fighter, but he was strong from years of farm work and he learned quickly. More importantly, he was willing to fight dirty. "There is no honor in this," Elara warned him as they practiced in the barn. "If you hesitate because you think something is unfair or cowardly, you will die." "I am defending my home from thieves and murderers," Connor said, breathing hard as he reset his stance with the boar spear. There is no such thing as unfair. They dug pits in the approach road and covered them with canvas and dirt, making them nearly invisible in the dark. They strung wire between fence posts at neck height where riders would pass. They built barriers from timber that would funnel attackers into kill zones, and they prepared the barn as a fallback position with loopholes for shooting, and only one easily defended entrance. On the third day, Connor taught Elara to shoot the hunting bow. She had never used one, relying instead on traps and silence when she hunted, but her hands were steady and her eye was good. By evening she could hit a man-sized target at 50 paces more often than not. "That will do," Connor said as they collected arrows in the fading light. "You will not be dueling anyone. You just need to make them keep their heads down." Elara knocked another arrow and drew, the bowstring creaking. She held the draw for a long moment, sighting down the shaft at the distant target, then released. The arrow flew true and struck dead center. "I am frightened," she said quietly, reaching for another arrow. "I have been frightened since I saw that crow's foot. I keep thinking I should run, that staying is madness." "Why do you stay then?" Elara was silent for 3 more arrows before she answered. "Because I am tired of running. Because this is the first place I have felt safe in 5 years. Because," she stopped, lowered the bow, turned to look at him in the gathering dusk. "Because I love you, Connor Fairweather, and I think I would rather die beside you than live without you." The words hit Connor like a physical blow, stealing his breath. He stared at her, this small, fierce woman with her green skin and her dark eyes and her steady hands, and felt something crack open in his chest. "I love you too," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I have loved you since the second winter, when you stayed up 3 nights with the sick calf and cried when it died. I have loved you through every sunrise and every season, and I have not said it because I am a coward about things that matter." Elara set down the bow carefully, as though it might shatter, and crossed the distance between them. She was so small against him when he pulled her close, the top of her head barely reaching his chin, but she was warm and solid and real in his arms. "We are both cowards, then," she said into his chest. "I have loved you longer and said less." They stood that way as the stars came out, holding each other in the farmyard they would soon defend. Connor thought about all the words they had not said, all the time they had wasted in silence. If they survived this, he promised himself, there would be no more silence between them. On the 4th day they prepared the house itself. They brought all the food and water inside, along with bandages and what little medicine they had. They shuttered the windows and barred the doors. They made the place as much a fortress as a farmhouse could be. That night, Connor took the new deed from his coat and showed it to Elara. She read it by lamplight, her finger tracing over the words that named her as equal owner, and he saw tears slip down her cheeks. "I did not know you had done this," she whispered. "I did it the first day I told you I would. I thought it was only talk, something said in the moment." She looked up at him, the deed still clutched in her hands. "This is real. This is legal. You truly gave me half of everything you own." "Everything we own," Connor corrected gently. "It was always ours, Elara. The paper just makes it official." She kissed him then, rising on her toes to press her lips to his, and it was sweet and desperate and full of everything they had not said for 2 years. Connor cupped her face in his hands, careful of her tusks, and kissed her back with all the love he had kept silent. "When this is over," Elara said when they finally broke apart, "I want to do this properly. I want to marry you in front of the village and the gods and everyone. I want there to be no question that we belong to each other." "Yes," Connor said simply. "Yes to all of that." They slept that night in each other's arms, stealing a few hours of peace before the storm they knew was coming. The new moon came on the 5th night, and with it, the Crow's Talon Company. Connor and Elara heard them long before they saw them. The creak of wagon wheels, the jingle of harness, the low voices of men who thought themselves unchallenged. They came up the road from the south just as Elara had predicted, 6 wagons with 4 men each, torches burning in the darkness. Connor and Elara waited in the barn, watching through gaps in the walls. Connor held the boar spear, his palms slick with sweat despite the cold night air. Elara had the bow, a quiver of 20 arrows at her hip. They had agreed she would shoot first, thinning the numbers before any fighting started. The first wagon hit the first pit. The sound was tremendous. The crack of breaking wood, the screaming of horses, the shouts of men as the whole front half of the wagon dropped into the hole and pitched forward. Men tumbled from the bed, and the horses thrashed in their traces, panicked and hurt. The second wagon pulled up short, the driver sawing at the reins. He shouted something to the men behind him, and riders began to spread out, trying to flank around the road. 2 of them hit the wire. It was worse than Connor had imagined. The steel wire, strung taut between posts at neck height, caught the first rider across the throat and swept him backward off his horse with such force that Connor heard the impact from 50 yards away. The second rider was luckier or perhaps unluckier. The wire caught him across the face and chest, shredding skin but not quite killing. He fell from his horse screaming, his hands clutching at the ruin of his features. "Now," Elara said quietly and rose to shoot. Her first arrow took a man through the chest as he dismounted to help his fallen comrades. Her second struck a driver in the shoulder, making him drop his reins. Her third, fourth, and fifth arrows came so fast Connor barely saw her knock them, each one finding a target, each one reducing the numbers. The Crow's Talon Company broke formation and scattered, some diving for cover, others charging blindly toward the barn. Connor lost count of how many Elara hit, but bodies littered the farmyard by the time the raiders found cover. A voice rang out across the darkness, hard and cold. "Whoever is in that barn, you have made a grave mistake. Come out now and we will make this quick. Make us come in after you and you will beg for death before we are done." "That is Garrett," Elara whispered, setting another arrow. "He is behind the third wagon." Connor cupped his hands and shouted back, "This is my land bought and paid for and you are trespassing. Leave now and I will let you tend your wounded. Stay and I will kill every last one of you." Garrett laughed, a cruel sound without humor. "Bold words from a farmer. But I know that bow, I know that shot pattern. Little Elara, is that you? Did you really think you could hide forever?" Elara's hands tightened on the bow, but she said nothing. "I thought you were dead," Garrett continued, his voice carrying easily through the night. "You cost me a week of tracking and 3 good men when you ran. I am almost impressed you survived this long." He paused. "Come out and face me, and I will let your farmer friend live. You have my word." "Your word is worth nothing," Elara called back, her voice steady despite the fear Connor could see in her eyes. "You are a thief and a murderer, and you prey on those who cannot fight back. But we can fight and we will not yield. So be it." The second assault came fast and organized. The raiders had taken their measure now, knew what they faced, and Garrett was a veteran commander. He sent men around both sides of the barn, while others laid down covering fire with crossbows, the bolts thudding into the barn walls and forcing Connor and Elara to duck away from the gaps. Connor heard footsteps on the barn roof and looked up in time to see a raider tearing at the shingles, trying to make a hole to drop through. He grabbed a hay fork and drove it up through the roof with all his strength. There was a scream, and something heavy rolled down the slope of the roof and fell to the ground with a wet crunch. Meanwhile, Elara had shifted to the back of the barn, shooting at the men trying to flank them. She hit one in the leg, dropped another with an arrow through the chest, but there were too many and they were too close. One of them reached the barn wall and began battering at it with an axe, the blade biting through the old wood. "Fall back to the house," Connor shouted. They had planned for this, drilled it. The barn was the first line, but not the last. Elara loosed 2 more arrows in quick succession, then turned and ran for the barn's side door. Connor followed, the boar spear in his hands, and they sprinted across the farmyard toward the house while crossbow bolts whistled around them. They almost made it. A raider came around the corner of the chicken coop, a sword in his hand and murder on his face. He was between them and the house, and he was fast. He lunged at Elara, the blade sweeping low to gut her. Connor threw himself forward and caught the blow on the boar spear's shaft. The impact jarred his arms, but the ash wood held. He shoved back, using his greater weight and strength, and drove the raider off balance. Elara did not hesitate. She drew her skinning knife and drove it up under the man's ribs, angling for the heart. The raider gasped and fell, and they left him dying in the dirt. They barricaded themselves in the house and caught their breath. Through the shuttered windows they could hear Garrett rallying his men, counting his losses, planning the next assault. Connor did a quick count in his head. They had dropped at least 10 raiders, maybe more. That left roughly 15, still more than enough to overwhelm 2 defenders. "We hurt them," Elara said, reloading her quiver from the supply they had stockpiled. "But not enough." "The barn will burn soon," Connor said, watching through a gap in the shutters. "He will use it for light to assault the house." As if summoned by his words, the first torch arced through the night and landed on the barn roof. It caught quickly, the dry wood and hay inside making it a bonfire within minutes. The farmyard lit up like midday, and Connor felt his heart sink. That barn had been his father's work, had sheltered 3 generations of livestock. "I am sorry," Elara said quietly, seeing his face. "It is wood and nails," Connor said, though his throat was tight. "We will build another." The raiders began their assault on the house with a battering ram, 4 men swinging a heavy timber at the front door while others covered them with crossbows. Connor and Elara shot through the loopholes they had prepared and dropped 2 of the ram carriers, but the others kept coming. The door was beginning to splinter when Elara said, "I have an idea. It is dangerous. Everything is dangerous. The root cellar connects to the barn's foundation. If I can get to it, I can come up behind them while they focus on the house." Connor started to argue, to say it was too risky, but he saw the determination in her eyes and knew she was right. They could not simply defend. They had to break the raiders' morale, make them afraid. "Take the knife and the hand axe," he said. "Stay low, stay quiet. I will make noise to cover you." Elara kissed him quickly, fiercely. "Do not die while I am gone. Same to you." She dropped through the trapdoor to the root cellar and disappeared into the darkness. Connor waited until he heard the scrape of stone that meant she had opened the tunnel. Then he began shooting through every loophole he could reach, making it seem like there were multiple defenders. He shouted curses at the raiders, dared them to come closer, made himself the center of attention. The front door finally gave way with a crash of splintering wood. 3 raiders charged through, swords drawn, and Connor met them with the boar spear in the narrow hallway. The first man ran right onto the blade, his momentum impaling him to the crossbar. Connor set the butt of the spear against the floor and let the dying man's weight hold it while he drew his own knife. The second raider tried to cut around his companion's body, and Connor kicked him in the knee, sending him sprawling. The third hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, Connor heard Elara's war cry from outside. She had come up through the burning barn, covered in soot and smoke, and fallen on the raiders from behind like a vengeful ghost. In the firelight, Connor saw her bury the hand axe in one man's spine, rip it free, and turn on another. She was small and fast and absolutely ferocious, and the raiders had not expected an attack from that direction. Connor left the boar spear where it was and grabbed the splitting maul they had stashed by the door. He charged out of the ruined doorway and into the firelit farmyard, roaring like a madman, and laid about him with the maul. He was not skilled, but he was strong and desperate, and the heavy hammer cracked skulls and shattered shoulders. The fight became chaos. In the dancing light of the burning barn, Connor lost track of individual moments. He swung the maul until his arms screamed. He saw Elara dancing between opponents, too fast for their blades, her knife finding throats and bellies. He saw raiders fall and others flee, breaking for their horses. And then he saw Garrett. The leader of the Crow's Talon Company had stayed back during the assault, directing his men. But now, he strode forward with a long sword in his hand and cold fury on his face. He was a big man, taller than Connor and broader across the shoulders, with the scars of a career soldier and the eyes of someone who had killed many times. "Elara," he called, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Enough. You and I settle this now and this ends." Elara turned to face him, her axe and knife dark with blood. "Yes," she said. "Let us settle it." Connor started to move to her side, but Garrett's sword flickered toward him in warning. "The farmer stays back. This is between me and my runaway property." "I am not your property," Elara said, her voice low and dangerous. "I was never your property. I am a free woman and this is my land, and you are going to leave or die." Garrett attacked without warning, his long sword sweeping in a wide arc meant to cleave Elara in half. She dropped under it, rolled, came up slashing with the knife. Garrett's armor turned the blade and he backhanded her with his offhand, sending her sprawling. Connor roared and charged, but two raiders stepped into his path, and he had to fight them or die. He traded blows with desperate speed, the maul too slow for proper fencing but devastating when it landed. He broke one man's arm and caved in the other's chest, but by the time he turned back, Garrett had Elara on the defensive. She was faster than Garrett, but he had reach and weight and skill. His sword was everywhere, forcing her back, giving her no opening to strike. Blood ran down her arm from a shallow cut, and she was limping. "You were always too soft," Garrett said as he pressed her toward the burning barn. "Too weak. I should have known you would run to some frontier farmer and play house. Better than playing executioner for cowards." Elara shot back and lunged with the knife. Garrett caught her wrist, twisted, and the knife fell from her hand. She still had the axe and she swung it with her offhand, but Garrett stepped inside the arc and drove his knee into her stomach. Elara doubled over, gasping, and Garrett raised his sword for the killing blow. Connor threw the maul. It was not a weapon designed for throwing, but he put everything he had into it. All his strength, all his fear, all his love for the woman about to die. The maul spun end over end across the farmyard and struck Garrett in the side of the head with a sound like a branch breaking. The mercenary leader dropped like a felled tree, his sword clattering from his hand. He did not get up. The remaining raiders saw their leader fall and their will broke. They ran for their horses, those who still could, and fled into the night. Connor let them go. He ran to Elara instead, dropping to his knees beside her. "Are you hurt? How badly are you hurt?" Elara was struggling to breathe, still winded from the knee to her stomach, but she managed a shaky smile. "I will live. You throw very well for a farmer." "I threw a maul at a man's head." "I think I am going to be sick. Later." Elara grabbed his arm and pulled herself upright, wincing. "Is he dead?" Connor checked Garrett's pulse and found it thready but present. No, unconscious. Good. We will want him alive for the magistrate. They bound Garrett with rope and locked him in the root cellar, the only structure that had not been damaged in the fighting. Then they did a count of the dead and wounded. 8 raiders lay dead in the farmyard. 3 more were wounded too badly to flee, and they surrendered without fight. The rest had run, perhaps 10 or 12 men scattered to the wind. The barn burned down to its foundation. The house door was ruined and 2 windows were broken. The fences were torn up from the wire traps, but they had held. They had won. As the sun rose over the battlefield, Connor and Elara sat on the porch steps, exhausted and bloody, and watched the smoke rise. Connor's hands would not stop shaking. He had killed men tonight, several of them, and the weight of it was settling on him like a stone. Elara took his hand and held it in both of hers. You did what you had to do. We both did. I know. It does not make it easier. No, it should not be easy. She leaned her head against his shoulder. But we are alive and they were wrong to come here. Remember that. At mid-morning, Connor rode to the county seat with Garrett bound and gagged in the saddle behind him, and the 3 wounded raiders stumbling along on foot. The magistrate took one look at the prisoners, listened to Connor's story, and sent riders to the militia captain. This is a serious accusation, the magistrate said, a thin man with gray hair and sharp eyes. It is a true one, Connor replied. I have witnesses, I have documents, and I have the man who led the Crow's Talon Company in my root cellar. The magistrate questioned the prisoners separately. Faced with certain hanging, 2 of the 3 wounded men confessed everything. The protection money paid to the militia captain, the ledgers Garrett kept of his collections, the location of the main camp. By nightfall, the magistrate had issued warrants for the arrest of the militia captain and orders for the King's Guard to raid the mercenary camp. Garrett himself was sentenced to hang for banditry, extortion, and murder. The sentence was carried out 3 days later in the town square. Connor did not attend, but Elara did. She stood in the crowd and watched the man who had enslaved her, beaten her, and hunted her drop through the trapdoor, and she felt nothing but a quiet relief that it was finished. The King's Guard found the Crow's Talon Company's camp abandoned. The mercenaries scattered to the 4 winds once word reached them that Garrett was captured. Some were caught in the following weeks. Most escaped. But the company itself was broken, its leadership dead or in chains, and it would never threaten the frontier again. The militia captain was stripped of his rank and sentenced to 5 years of hard labor. A new captain was appointed, one who had not been bought, and the Crown sent a small garrison to reinforce the frontier militia and prevent other mercenary bands from taking the Crow's Talon Company's place. Through all of this, Connor and Elara worked to rebuild. The barn was gone, but the village sent men to help raise a new one. It was smaller than the old barn, but sturdier, and built with green oak that would last 100 years. Neighbors who had been distant before, who had looked at Elara with suspicion because she was an orc, came to help because she had defended her home with a courage they could respect. The farmhouse door was repaired. The fences were rebuilt. The land healed, and so did they. 6 weeks after the raid, on a cold morning in late autumn, Connor took Elara's hand and led her to the village square. The priest was waiting, and so was a small crowd of neighbors and friends. Connor had put on his father's good coat, and Elara wore a dress that the blacksmith's wife had helped her make, pale blue wool that set off her green skin beautifully. "Are you certain you want this?" Elara asked as they approached the church steps. "There will be talk. There are still those who think I am a monster." "Let them talk," Connor said. "I love you, Elara Lightfoot, and I want the whole world to know it." The ceremony was simple. They spoke their vows before the priest and the gathered witnesses, promising to love and honor each other all their days. When the priest pronounced them married, Connor kissed his wife while the villagers applauded, and Elara grinned so wide her tusks showed. They held the wedding feast in the new barn, the first event in the new building. Tables were laden with food that neighbors had brought, and there was music and dancing and laughter. The blacksmith toasted the couple. The magistrate, who had ridden out from the county seat, gave a speech about courage and justice. Children ran between the adults' legs, playing games. Connor danced with his wife in the barn they had built together, on the land they had defended together, and thought he had never been happier. Elara's hand was warm in his, and when she looked up at him, her dark eyes were bright with joy. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," Connor replied. "Every day, for the rest of my life." Winter came, and the farm settled into the quiet rhythm of the cold season. There was less work to do outdoors, and Connor and Elara spent the long evenings by the fire, planning for the spring planting and talking about the future. Elara taught Connor words in the Orc tongue, and he taught her the songs his mother had sung. They were learning each other in a new way as husband and wife, and it was sweet and strange and good. In the spring, Elara discovered she was pregnant. Connor wept when she told him, overcome with emotion he could not name. They had talked about children in the abstract, but the reality of it that Elara carried his child, that they would be parents, struck him with a force he had not anticipated. "Are you well?" he asked, hovering over her like a nervous bird. "Do you need anything? Should you be resting?" Elara laughed and pushed him gently away. "I am pregnant, Connor, not dying. I can still work. I can still fight if I need to, though let us hope I do not need to." "Still," Connor said, "let me worry. It is what I am good at." The pregnancy progressed without complication. Elara's belly grew round, and Connor built a cradle from cherry wood, sanding it smooth so there would be no splinters. The blacksmith's wife, who had delivered half the babies in the village, promised to come when Elara's time arrived, in the late summer. On a warm night when the crickets sang and the stars were bright, Elara went into labor. The blacksmith's wife came and took charge, sending Connor to boil water and fetch blankets and generally stay out of the way. He paced in the kitchen, listening to Elara's labored breathing from the bedroom, and prayed to every god he knew. Just before dawn he heard the cry of a newborn and his heart stopped. The blacksmith's wife appeared in the doorway, smiling. "You have a daughter," she said. "Both mother and baby are well." Connor rushed into the bedroom and found Elara sitting up in bed, exhausted and radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. The baby was perfect, green-skinned like her mother, with a tuft of dark hair and tiny pointed ears. She had Connor's nose and Elara's eyes, and when she looked up at him, he felt his heart crack open with love. "Hello, little one," he whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand. Her fingers wrapped around his, and he was lost. "What should we name her?" Elara asked. Connor thought for a moment. They had discussed names, but nothing had felt right. Looking at his daughter now, though, a name came to him. "Emma," he said. "Emma Fairweather, if you agree." "Emma," Elara repeated, testing the sound. She smiled. "Yes, that is perfect." Emma grew quickly, as half-orc children did. By 6 months she was toddling around the farmyard, getting into everything. By a year she was speaking in full sentences, a chatter of mixed human and orc words that made her parents laugh. She was bright and curious and fearless, and Connor and Elara adored her. The farm prospered. Connor and Elara had paid off their debts with the money the crown awarded them for capturing Garrett and breaking the Crow's Talon Company. They bought more livestock, expanded their fields, and hired a young man from the village to help with the heavy work. The new barn filled with hay and grain, and the pastures with cattle and sheep. 2 years after Emma was born, Elara gave birth to a son. They named him Kieran, and he was as different from his sister as night from day. Quiet where she was loud, cautious where she was bold, but just as loved. Connor built an addition onto the farmhouse to give the children their own room, and Elara sewed curtains for the windows. The village, which had once been wary of the orc woman in their midst, came to respect and even admire Elara Fairweather. She was known as a fierce defender of her home, a skilled healer of animals, and a woman of her word. Children waved to her in the street, and neighbors asked her advice on everything from sick livestock to troubled marriages. Connor's love for his wife deepened with each passing year. He loved the way she sang to the children in her native tongue, the way she could gentle a frightened horse with just her voice, the way she laughed at his terrible jokes. He loved her strength and her softness, her courage and her kindness. On their 5th wedding anniversary, he carved her a wooden box and filled it with letters, one for every day of their marriage, each one telling her something he loved about her. Elara cried when she read them and kissed him until they were both breathless. "You are a sentimental fool," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I am your sentimental fool," Connor replied. "Yes, yes, you are." They grew older together, building a life richer than either had dreamed possible. The farm thrived. The children grew strong and healthy. The village prospered, and the frontier became safer as the crown's presence grew stronger. On a spring morning 10 years after the raid, Connor and Elara stood in the farmyard and watched Emma and Kieran play with the new lambs. Emma was teaching her brother how to bottle feed a lamb whose mother had rejected it, and Kieran was listening with the serious attention he brought to everything. "You ever think about that night?" Connor asked quietly. "The raid?" "Sometimes," Elara said. "Less now than I used to. It feels like it happened to different people." She slipped her hand into his. "I was so frightened that night I thought we would both die. So did I." Connor squeezed her hand. "I am glad we were both wrong. I am glad you were stubborn," Elara said with a smile. "I am glad you refused to let me run. I am glad you loved me enough to fight." "I would fight 100 battles for you," Connor said. 1,000. "Let us hope you do not have to." Elara leaned against him, and they stood together in the warm sun, watching their children, surrounded by the land they had defended and the life they had built. "This is enough. This is everything." Connor kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair, the familiar warmth of her beside him. "Yes," he agreed, "this is everything." In the years that followed, they would face other challenges. Droughts and hard winters, the normal trials of raising children and running a farm, the small griefs and joys of ordinary life. But they faced them together, as they had always done, and their love remained the foundation on which everything else was built. The farm passed down through the generations, a place where human and orc lived side by side, where love mattered more than blood, and where courage meant defending what you held dear. The story of the raid became legend in the village, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. The farmer and the orc girl who had stood against an army and won. But for Connor and Elara, it was simply the beginning. The night they had chosen each other over safety, love over fear, and in that choosing had found everything they had ever wanted. They lived long lives, filled with work and love and laughter. They saw their children marry and have children of their own. They grew old together, their hands still finding each other across the table, their love still as strong as it had been that dawn when they had stood in the ruins of their barn and sworn they would rebuild. And when, many years later, Connor Fairweather died peacefully in his sleep with his wife's hand in his, the village mourned a good man who had lived well and loved deeply. Elara buried him in the orchard they had planted together, under the apple trees that bloomed white in the spring. She lived 5 more years after that, long enough to see her grandchildren grown, long enough to know that the life she and Connor had built would continue long after she was gone. And when her time came, the village buried her beside her husband and carved both their names on a single stone. Connor Fairweather and Elara Fairweather, beloved husband and wife, who had defended their home and built a legacy of courage and love. The farm remains to this day, still worked by their descendants, still a place where the old story is remembered. And on quiet nights when the moon is dark and the wind whispers through the fields, some say you can still hear the echo of that long-ago battle. The clash of steel, the thrum of bowstrings, and the voice of a small orc woman declaring that she would not yield, that this land was hers, that love was worth defending with everything she had. It is a good story, a true story, and it reminds those who hear it that courage is not the absence of fear but the choice to stand and fight despite it. That love is not always easy or simple, but it is always worth the cost. And that home is not just a place, but the people you choose to stand beside, the ground you defend together, the life you build with your own hands and your own heart. Connor and Elara knew this. They lived it. And in living it, they left behind something far more valuable than land or gold. They left behind proof that different worlds can meet and make something beautiful, that love can bridge any divide, and that sometimes the most important battles are the ones we fight not for glory or gain, but simply to protect what we hold most dear. Their children told their children, and those children told theirs, and so the story lived on, not as legend or myth, but as truth, as testament, as reminder that in this world of darkness and danger, light and love can still prevail if we are brave enough to fight for them. And in the end, that is all anyone can hope for. To love well, to fight bravely, and to leave the world a little better than we found it. Connor and Elara Fairweather did all three, and their legacy endures, a beacon of hope in troubled times, a promise that courage and love together can overcome any obstacle, defeat any enemy, and build a future worth living. The farm still stands. The orchard still blooms. And somewhere in the hills beyond, where the frontier gives way to wilderness, the descendants of that long-ago couple still tend the land, still honor the memory of the farmer and the orc girl who loved each other enough to risk everything. And in that risk, found everything worth having. It is a good ending to a good story. But more than that, it is a good life, well lived and deeply loved. And in the end, that is the only story that truly matters. Not the battles we fight or the enemies we defeat, but the love we give, and the lives we touch, and the legacy we leave behind when our own story reaches its final page. Connor and Elara's story ended where all good stories end, with love triumphant, courage rewarded, and two souls who found each other against all odds and chose to build a life together, no matter the cost. They lived, they loved, they fought, and they won. And in winning, they gave the world something precious, proof that it can be done, that love is real, that courage matters, and that home is worth defending. May we all be so lucky. May we all be so brave. May we all find someone worth fighting for, and may we have the courage to stand when the darkness comes, to defend what we love, and to build something beautiful in the ashes of battle. That is the lesson of Connor and Elara Fairweather. That is the gift they left behind. And that is the story that will never die, because it is written not just in words but in the very land they defended, the very earth they tended, the very lives they touched and shaped and made better by their presence. This is their story. This is their legacy. This is how they will be remembered, not as legends, but as people who loved truly and fought bravely and lived well. And in the end, That is the greatest story any of us can hope to tell.